So when we say that something is exemplary, we're saying that thing or that person really stands apart. The word exemplary is defined as serving as a desirable model or representing the best of its kind. You could say that Sir Isaac Newton was an exemplary scientist. I mean, the dude discovered gravity. How do you discover? I mean, we just take it for granted. We know that there is this force that just pulls things to the ground. This guy discovered that. He discovered the color spectrum. We know that light has all these different spectrums, you know. He's a dude who discovered that. I think the one that always blew me away is this, that Sir Isaac Newton discovered calculus. How do you discover calculus? I remember when I would be in class, I thought I was a genius when I would get a calculus problem right. Can you imagine discovering calculus for you guys who hate mathematics and you take a calc class? Well, you could thank good old Sir Isaac for that one. There have been countless scientists over the years, but I would say Sir Isaac Newton was exemplary. How about fast food service? I don't want to throw any specific burger joints under the bus, but you know how it is. You're like, okay, fine, I'm going to go to that place. And there's only 2 people in front of you in line in the drive-thru, but it takes so long, you finally just give in, you put it in park. Like, really? What are they ordering? And then you get up, it's your turn, and you realize it wasn't the person ordering, it was the person taking the order. Fine, you get up there, you get your meal, and they tell you, oh, wait a minute, you're going to have to pull up a little bit. Someone's going to bring that thing out to you because we don't have it ready. You're like, you don't have a cheeseburger ready? What's wrong with this place? And then you think, that's why I told myself last time, I'm never coming back here. And then there's Chick-fil-A. It doesn't matter that the drive-through line wraps around the entire building. You know they have 4 to 8 people out there with their iPads, their headsets on. You order your thing. There is no problem. You get exactly what you want, and there is no shame for asking for more Chick-fil-A sauce. I would say when it comes to fast food service, Chick-fil-A is certainly exemplary. How about in the world of sports? Jackie Robinson was the first African American to break the color barrier when he was signed by the Brooklyn Dodgers on April 15th, 1947. He won the Rookie of the Year. He made 6 consecutive All-Star appearances. He won the MVP in 1949, made it to the World Series 6 times, only won once, but he still won a World Series in 1955. But all of this happened in the midst of hate mail, death threats against himself, his wife, even his own children, and even real physical acts of violence, all because of the color of his skin. Well, it didn't stop there. After his baseball career, he goes on to become the first black vice president of an American corporation. He establishes the Freedom National Bank and was the first black TV analyst in baseball. And so for good reason, did you know that the number 42, Jackie Robinson's number, is the only number that is retired on every single baseball team in the league? In fact, April 15th now is recognized every single year as Jackie Robinson Day. So every single player in the Major League Baseball League is going to don the number 42. Jackie Robinson was not only an exemplary baseball player, but he was an exemplary human being, period. In Matthew chapter 5 and verses 33 through 48, Jesus is going to describe the exemplary Christian life, but I want to be clear. He's not describing the Christian who's set apart amongst other Christians. Instead, Jesus is going to tell us that the Christian life, for those who choose to live it, is in and of itself exemplary. He'll describe it as such in 3 ways. In verses 33 through 37, we'll see that the exemplary Christian life is truthful. In verses 38 to 42, we'll see that the exemplary Christian life, it doesn't exact vengeance. And then finally, in verses 43 through 47, we'll see that the Christian life loves even its own enemies. And to be absolutely clear that the Christian life is to be exemplary, we'll finish our section today where Jesus says in verse 48 that you and I shall be perfect, even as our Father in heaven is perfect. Today, we're studying the exemplary Christian life. Now, lies are so part of the everyday makeup of our lives. It really would make an exemplary person to never tell a lie. Would you not agree? Two students were arguing when their teacher entered the classroom. Well, why are you guys arguing? One boy answered, well, we found a $10 bill and decided to give it to whoever tells the biggest lie. The teacher responded, you should be ashamed of yourselves. When I was your age, I didn't even know what a lie was. The two boys looked at one another, nodded in agreement, and then gave the teacher the $10 bill. Lies are so part of the makeup of our everyday lives. Not only is it unimaginable to not tell a lie, to not know what a lie is, that you can't even conceive that. In verses 33 through 37, Jesus is going to discuss the subject of taking oaths. But really, behind the subject of taking oaths, the real issue at hand here is truthfulness. I want to read to you the words of D.A. Carson concerning this passage. He says the contextual purpose, right, the context of this passage is to stress the true direction in which the Old Testament points, namely the importance of truthfulness. With that said, we now start in verse 33 where Jesus says, again, you have heard it said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but you shall perform your oaths to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you swear by your head. I don't know who is doing that. But you shouldn't swear by your head because you cannot make one hair white or black. Now, would you be surprised, probably not, to know that there are Christians who say because of this we should not dye our hair? Crazy, huh? People interpret the scriptures. Go ahead, dye your hair whatever color you want. That's not what Jesus is talking about. But let your yes be yes and your no, no, for whatever is more than these is from the evil one. So Jesus is here addressing the subject of taking oaths. Now, in the Old Testament, there were two primary reasons why an individual would take an oath. The first one was an act of adoration and thanksgiving to God. God delivers a person makes an oath, they take a vow. Lord, I'm going to give this thing to you. I'm going to sacrifice this thing for you. So it's an act of adoration or worship to the Lord. The second reason or purpose behind an oath was to emphasize the truth of what was being said. So just as it is today in our court of law, we put people under oath to emphasize the importance to tell the truth and that what the person is saying really is true. So as Jesus is here addressing oath, he's prohibiting both forms. But I think it's clear that he's really specifically addressing the second form or purpose of an oath. That is, he's prohibiting the use of oaths in order to stress the truth of what is being said. So he says, let your yes be yes, your no, no. Now, before we go any further, I want us to know, what does the Old Testament say about taking an oath? Well, we find this here in Numbers chapter 30, verse 2, that if a man makes a vow to the Lord or swears by an oath to bind himself by some agreement, he shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth. Now, there's an important word there, and it begins that verse, and that word is if. In other words, from this verse alone, one could say that, you really didn't have to take an oath. But we see something more interesting later on in the book of Deuteronomy, where God actually gives a command in the affirmative. He says, you shall fear the Lord your God and serve him. And notice, you shall, that's a positive commandment, take oaths in his name. So here, Old Testament says, you shall take oaths. Jesus in verse 34 says, don't swear at all. Look, Jesus understood very well what the law said. He also knew how it was going to sound to his audience because they knew what the law said. And so the more we study this passage, the more we appreciate the words that Jesus prefaced this whole section with. Do you remember that? In verse 17, do not think that I came to destroy the law and the prophets. Why? Because I think if you're an honest listener, you're going to think like, wow, it sounds like he's contradicting the law and the prophets. So what I think is going to help is to better understand, just from taking a step or two back, the difference, a comparison, if you will, between the law of Moses and the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven does not contradict the law of Moses at all. To understand Jesus' commands concerning the kingdom of heaven, it's helpful to picture a world in which there never was sin, predating the law back to the Garden of Eden. For instance, do you think that in the Garden of Eden there were any laws concerning divorce? Of course not. That was a result of the fall. How about this? Can you picture Adam being put under oath in the Garden of Eden? Of course not. All there was truth. The concept of a lie, it didn't even exist in the Garden of Eden. This is exactly how Jesus is going to address the subject on divorce and remarriage in Matthew chapter 19. He'll tell the religious leaders that in the beginning, yes, God permitted divorce, but it wasn't the original intent. You see, there's two ways to make a mess on the floor. You could spill rice on the ground, and you could sweep it up or vacuum it. Or you could spill ink and picture it being a carpet. What can you do with that? Merely cover it up. In a sense, that's the way that the law functioned in certain areas. The law's purpose wasn't to just completely extract the problem of sin from the world, but it's dealing with the problem of sin that had so spread throughout the world, there was no way that they were going to undo the reality of divorce. No way that they were going to undo the reality where almost every single agreement was done by taking an oath, swearing in the name of your God. This even pertains to slavery. It was a horrible act, but because it was so ubiquitous in the ancient world, God just worked with it according to the law. Now, when Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven, it's not putting something over the ink stain, it's completely removing the carpet, going back to the way it should be from the beginning. But it's still interesting. Why would God command that oaths be taken in his name when it was never part of God's plan that anyone ever take an oath to begin with? Well, I want to give you guys an Old Testament example. When we understand in the ancient world, like I said earlier, almost every single agreement was done by taking an oath in the name of your God, be it Zeus, Baal, whoever. And so the command to take oaths in the name of Yahweh, the stress wasn't you shall take oaths, it was in my name. Look, everyone's taking an oath. When you do so, in my name. There was this situation in which Uncle Laban and Jacob were not getting along. And so they finally said, look, you stay on your side of the turf and I'll stay on mine. And what they did is they erected this pillar of stones. They said it was a witness. And so Laban says this. He says, if you or I cross this pillar of rocks, may the God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, which was his father, Abraham's, the God of their father judge between us. So Laban takes an oath in the name of his God. But there's a problem, because Abraham didn't even know the true and living God, Yahweh, until he was 75 years old. So what Laban is doing, he's talking about a completely other God that Abraham used to worship, that Abraham's father worshiped because he was a pagan, and of course, all of his descendants. But now Jacob clarifies who he's going to swear on. We see that Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. Why? Because the God who spoke to Abraham and who spoke to Isaac was different than Laban's God. Do you see that? So what he's saying is that there is a difference between your God and my God. It was a way to give testimony to the ancient world that the God of Israel is Yahweh, not any God that you choose, dependent upon the situation. So just as the laws concerning divorce didn't mean that God was pleased with divorce, but it was rather, it deals with a reality of living in a fallen world. The law didn't command that people unnecessarily take oaths. But really, God commanded that when it was done, it should be done in his name. But you see, the religious leaders, that's somewhat of a scaled importance based upon what you take an oath in. Well, obviously, you don't want to take an oath in God's name. But what if you do so in heaven? Earth, your head, and maybe not a big deal if you don't follow through on what you say. Then Jesus strikes at the real issue concerning the concept of taking oaths. Taking an oath, when you think about it, it's done in order to express the truth. It's done to say, well, this time I'm not lying. Isn't that I swear. Oh, bro, honestly, I say that all the time. Honestly, not going to lie. Like, you mean those other times? Like, what do I say about those, Well, you see, these are tools in essence, and of course we don't want to be so legalistic, but these are tools that are needed in essence for liars, right? He says anything else is from the evil one, the devil, or the father of lies. Let your yes be yes and your no, no. Here's a question. So what does this mean for the Christian who has to bear witness under oath in a court of law? Should we, as the Jehovah's Witnesses and even the Quakers teach, should we refuse to bear witness or give a witness under oath? How did Jesus respond when he was placed under oath? He was placed under oath? Yeah. In fact, we see this in Matthew chapter 26, verses 63 and 64. When he's on trial, can you go ahead, go to the next slide, Steve? Yeah, that's crazy. Okay, I'm going to tell you what happens. So we see the entire trial, that Jesus is silent. And then the high priest says to him, I charge you under oath. Swear to us if you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. When he was placed under oath, you know what Jesus did? He finally spoke up and responded. So even Jesus Christ himself, whose name is the truth, would testify under oath. How much more should we if the occasion should arise? Now, when we understand that this blanket statement, you shall not swear at all, there are some outliers, right? Some anomalies where it doesn't fully apply. Again, I want to restate the words of D.A. Carson concerning the thrust of this command. The contextual purpose of this passage is to stress the direction in which the Old Testament points, namely the importance of truthfulness. The exemplary Christian life is truthful. So if we honor truth, we say it's exemplary, why does it appear to be so rare? I'm sure we can come up with so many reasons, but I'll give you two. First of all, the truth is painful, and so many abstain from it. Like alcohol to an open wound, so also can truth be to our prejudices and our shortcomings. Former ABC newscaster Ted Koppel once said that our society finds truth too strong a medicine to digest undiluted. In its purest form, truth is not a polite tap on the shoulder. It is a howling reproach. Hey, truth can be painful. When I will share the gospel with people, I'll often ask people if they know why they killed Jesus. And I'll at times get the response, well, to pay for our sins. No, that's why God sent Jesus to the cross. But why did people kill Jesus? What I'm trying to extract is that they didn't kill Jesus because he was saying that God loves you, God has great plans for you. He must have been saying things that were offensive in order for them to hear that Jesus was giving us bad news. Jesus was going around saying, enter by the narrow gate, for wide and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many who go in by it. That's truth, but that's a painful truth. One of Jesus' titles is the truth, and the truth came into this world, and the world sentenced the truth to death by crucifixion. Oftentimes we abstain from telling and receiving the truth because it can be painful. The second reason why truth appears to be so rare in the world is that truth is often inconvenient. There was a wife who said to her husband, well, why are you home so late? And the husband said, oh, well, there was a man who lost his $100 bill. Oh, how sweet. Were you helping him look for it? No, replied the husband. I was standing on it. Well, concealing that $100 bill sure was convenient for that husband. So you live in a school district. that may not be the best school district around, but your parents conveniently live in a school district that is better. Now, your children don't really live with your parents, but in order to get your children in that school district, you say that they live with them. Now, of course, clearly the line in the sand was drawn. Let your yes be yes. You shall not bear false witness. And yet the person justifies it to themselves, saying, well, I want the best for my children. And I would challenge that, first of all, by asking, how is giving an example of lying to authorities when there is absolutely no danger imposed upon you nor your family ever in the best interests of your children? The end goal in life is not to get our children into a good school, it's obedience to Jesus Christ. Or else, as Jesus says, why do you call me Lord, Lord? Oftentimes we can lie because the truth is often inconvenient. But we do have to be careful concerning being exemplary in regards to the truth. You know, some people can take this as an excuse and a cover-up. Well, I just tell it like it is, you know. I just speak my mind. And oftentimes people will say, you know, I speak my mind, I speak the truth. And they usually do that because they're saying offensive things. And they'll say, well, I want people to speak the truth to me. And then you find out when someone actually does speak the truth to them, they're the most sensitive, the most irritated person when you actually do so. Why? Because it's a cover-up. It's really a person who's just being rude. It's true, the Bible commands us to be exemplary men and women of the truth. But how often does the Bible command us to be merciful, to be kind, to be compassionate? The Bible commands us to speak the truth in love. As Jesus is teaching us concerning the exemplary Christian life, we see that the Christian life is truthful. Well, next up in verses 38 through 42, we'll see that the Christian life does not exact vengeance. Starting now in verse 38, he says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you not to resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. Now think about this. The majority of the world is right-handed. Therefore, to be struck across the right cheek meant it was a backhanded slap. Hey, it's one thing to be slapped. That's degrading. How much more to receive a backhand? But Jesus still says, turn to him the other also. Verse 40, if anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. Whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. You see, the Roman soldiers, at times by law, were permitted to recruit people in order to help them in their work. That's why we'll see later on that they forced Simon of Cyrene to carry the cross of Jesus. They were allowed to do that. Well, Jesus says, whatever they compel you to do, double it. Give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away. So the thrust behind the legal code in the law of Moses is known as lex talionis. Lex is Latin for law, talio for retaliation. So you could really call it the law of retaliation. Lex talionis means that the judgment that is meted out to the criminal is to resemble the result of the crime. So we see this in Exodus chapter, do we have that or no? I have to do some finger exercises now. Exodus 21, 23 to 25. But if any harm follows a certain crime, then you shall give life for life, capital punishment, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. We get the picture. So whatever pain the criminal inflicts upon someone else, the criminal is thus to receive the very same pain. So it's the law of retaliation. But let's be clear, when the law of Moses commanded the Israelite people that they practice lex talionis, it wasn't a command to the general public that they were therefore to take vengeance into their own hands. The command was given, yes, to all of the people, just as the Constitution and our own laws are given to us. But that doesn't mean that we become lawyers and judges and politicians. It's good for us to be aware of them in order to keep our leaders accountable. And so it was for the law of Moses. But as it related to those laws, what would happen is there would be a court that would be comprised of a board of elders, certain elders that would judge a matter. And it would be those elders that would then apply lex talionis. And they would be the ones that would say, okay, you cut off his hand. Now they would tell the person who was injured, now you go cut off his hand. But it was never meant for the individual to take vengeance into their own hands. Now, Jesus is not saying here that lex talionis is bad, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. This isn't a time for a political science debate, but what's interesting, when you look at Muslim countries, their crime rate is 4 times less than the world average. And it makes sense. If justice is equal to the crime committed and something that's lacking in our judicial system, if it is swift, crime rates drop. Jesus is not here challenging the idea of lex talionis. Neither is he telling the world how they should establish their penal code. What Jesus is doing, he's correcting this misapplication of the law that believed that God desired that you and I take vengeance into our own hands. And I hope it's clear as you read some of these commands from Jesus that if we were to apply all that Jesus said without variance, our culture and ourselves would be worse off. So let's say your child comes home from school and they tell you that they're being bullied. And there is this kid day after day hitting him in the back of the head, making fun of him in front of his friends, asking him for his lunch money. And the kid, out of fear, your son has to give it to him. So what do you tell your child in that situation? Do we tell them, turn the other cheek? Give to him who asks? No, of course not. Most likely you're going to say, well, did you tell your teachers? Yes, but they didn't do anything. Then maybe you take your kid, you set up an appointment. I say you let your child see that you are zealous for your child's protection and meet with a teacher, meet with someone. Hey, maybe you pray about it and there is a time for something like this. And maybe you just tell your kid, hey, the next time he does that, what? Just sock him. Just give him an uppercut to the chin or whatever it is. By incorrectly applying Jesus' words to a bully, your child will be worse off. Do Jesus' words, give to everyone who asks, mean that we're really supposed to give to every single homeless person that asks? The only person who would come to that conclusion is a person who's never spent any time in a city. Can you imagine in the cities of India? It said when you step out of a taxi cab in Mumbai, there are boys, girls, men, and women that are surrounding you, begging you for money because they see you're an American. Would it not be foolish to really try to give to everyone there? So what is the difference? Right? How are we as Bible students, followers of Jesus, to know when Jesus' words apply? Well, just as it's the make it or break it in many court cases, the difference here is intent. As it pertains to the bullying situation, it's not revenge to give that bully an uppercut to the chin or a groin kick or whatever it is. It is self-defense, self-respect. As it relates to giving to the poor, it's not being stingy to not give to every single person. I remember when I worked in Houston, every single day I would pass by multiple people asking me for money with a cardboard sign or whatever it is. And I'm sure you've got your own stories. I remember this one lady every day. She had her cardboard sign and she would limp around asking for money. And after over a year of seeing this lady, I remember one day I see someone walking with a cardboard sign under their arm, talking on a smartphone without any limp at all. Sometimes we don't give to everyone by exercising sheer prudence. We're not to give to every single person who asks us. The real question is, what's your intent? We can't give to every single homeless person at every intersection, but can't we give to some? Well, they might go spend it on booze or drugs, and they might go spend it on a hamburger and a hot coffee. God's looking at your heart, and he wants to give you a blessing by the intent of your heart. If the intent is truly to help people, you know that there are great organizations out there that are feeding and ministering to those who are helpless and homeless. The intent isn't self-seeking, it's blessing others. But again, the true heart of this section is that the exemplary Christian life, it doesn't exact revenge, right? Isn't that what Jesus is saying? Hey, if they slap you, don't slap them back. If they want your coat, don't get angry. Give them your shirt also. They want to push you 1 mile, go 2. The exemplary Christian life does not exact revenge. Now, sadly, some people, even at times Christians, can act a lot like Marvin Haymeyer. Who's Marvin Haymeyer? He was a welder who owned a muffler shop. Well, there was a certain time where this concrete factory wanted to buy his property. And so they had agreed on a certain amount, and then Marvin backed out. Well, the concrete factory wanted that piece of property. And so they began lobbying to their local politicians, and they were successful. And so what they did is they rezoned the city, and as it turned out, his property where the muffler shop was now worthless. Well, you could imagine then Marvin fought back tooth and nail. But when it turned out that he wasn't going to make any success at all, can we get that picture up there? Oh, please. No, it's a bummer. Okay, he makes what's called a killdozer, okay? It was a bulldozer that was covered in a layer of concrete, and over that was steel. He had this whole thing mapped out. He ends up taking down local businesses of his adversaries. He took out the police station and even took out the former mayor's house. The thing was bulletproof. They had armor-piercing bullets that could not penetrate this guy's killdozer. I suggest you look it up online. It's really quite a trip. The only reason this guy was, unable to keep going was because the engine eventually stalled. Later, residents claimed that he would spend hours in his concealed shed. Now we know he was making this machine of vengeance. When some people are wronged by others, they can respond like Marvin Haymeyer, not building a bulletproof tank, but seething and allowing to fester past wrongs done against them, going day after day into that dark place in your mind instead of healing from resentment, forgiving the person, making amends where they need to be made. And the resentment is merely used to to feed the fire of their justified anger. You see, the Christian life does not exact revenge. There is a direct one-to-one correlation between the lack of a vengeful spirit and one's relationship with God. There's a direct relationship between the lack of a vengeful spirit and one's relationship with God. Joseph, sold by his brothers to be a slave in Egypt. He'd be a slave for about 11 years, 2 years in prison. Finally, his brothers come before him bowing down. And certainly Joseph has the opportunity to do whatever he wanted to. Time goes on. Jacob, their father, had died. And so now, out of fear, we understand this. They're terrified that Joseph is now going to exact vengeance on his brothers, because this is what most people would do. And if anyone had the authority to do it, it was Joseph. But what we find, and I have to read this in Genesis chapter 50 and verses 20 and 21. Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you meant evil against me." So he didn't minimize what they did to him. He acknowledges it. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. You see, it was his relationship with God that enabled him to suffer and not have a vengeful spirit in order to bring it about as it is this day to save many people alive. Now, therefore, do not be afraid. Not only does he forgive them, he says, I will provide for you and your little ones. You're talking going the extra mile, giving them your shirt also. He'll provide for you and your little ones, and he comforted them, the ones who sold him to be a slave, and he spoke kindly to them. See, it was Joseph's lack of a vengeful spirit. It was due to his relationship with God. Or how about David? David was Saul's most trusted soldier, yet out of jealousy, David was forced to flee the land that he loved for his life. For years, his life was spent going from cave to cave, trying to preserve his life from Saul, who wanted to kill him. Well, in one such occurrence, Saul had encircled David in the cave in which he was hiding. Saul goes to relieve himself, and unknown to him, he goes right into the cave where David and his men were hiding. And so we get this. His soldiers are now thinking, David, now is your chance. Take vengeance on yourself. To which David replies, It's just to build the suspense, is it not? Oh, tell me, George, what is it? Well, I will now. 24:6. Can we get you up here, Jay? Give me some drum rolls while I'm waiting to read these. And he said to them, the Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master. The Lord's anointed to stretch out my hand against him, seeing that he is the anointed of the Lord. How was it you're forced to leave even your own family, the land that you love, fearing for your life? How was it that Joseph was able to forgive and even bless his brothers? How was it that when David had the opportunity, and the whole nation would have supported David, that he didn't take vengeance into his own hands? It's because of their relationship with God to understand that no matter what people do to us, no matter what their intentions may be, as Joseph said, that we understand that there is a sovereign God who's working out all these things together for our good. So whether it's the way that your ex-spouse has treated you, how difficult that can be, or maybe a father that wasn't there when you were growing up and resentments you may have against him, or something that someone close to you said that was so cutting that is so hard to forget, the closer our relationship with God, the less of a vengeful spirit we'll have. You see, the exemplary Christian life doesn't exact vengeance. Now, if there's something that was most striking, most exemplary about the Christian life, I would say it would be our third and final point. And that is, the exemplary Christian life loves even its own enemies. Verse 43, Jesus says that you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven, for he makes his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the just and on the unjust. And I just think of all these things, to know that someone's using you, isn't that like the worst? But think about God. These people who deny God, take his name in vain, and yet they're using his blessings in order to satisfy themselves. This is the nature of God. He does it all the time. For if you love those who love you, what reward have you? Don't even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet your brethren only, what do you do more than others? Do not even tax collectors do so? So these tax collectors you guys are always putting down, you know better than them. Therefore you shall be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. Now, if ever there was a mark that set apart the early church, it was this. The early church was consistent in its love for its enemies. It began with Stephen in Acts chapter 7. Here is this man preaching faithfully the gospel to these religious leaders, and then they began to stone him to death. And I just want you to think about this when we hear about a stoning. I picture him to be somewhat of a young, healthy man. What kind of trauma, physical impact repeatedly must it take to bring a completely healthy man to the point of death? How crazy is that? They say they would dig holes and put the person in the hole, and in this way they'd throw stones on their head. Just horrific. And so as this is going on, Stephen cries out, look, I see in the heavens. It is opened, and the Son of Man is standing at the right hand of God. His final words being, Lord, do not charge them with this sin. Praying for the forgiveness of his enemies, one of them being a young man named Saul. And so from that point forward, whether it was being flogged, whether it was being tortured, even burned at the stake, there are many accounts of Christian martyrs who have suffered praying for and thus loving their own enemies. That's radical. You know, the law taught in Leviticus that they were to love their own neighbor. But doesn't this bring up the question, well, who's my neighbor? If I have to love my neighbor, those who are not my neighbor, I guess I don't have to love them. And when you consider there are such passages that were given to Joshua to not have mercy on the inhabitants of the land of Canaan, right? The Perizzites, the Hittites, so on and so forth. They came to the conclusion that therefore you love your neighbor, but what? You hate your enemy. But did the law really teach that? No, the law taught no such thing. In fact, though not explicitly, implicitly, the law really did teach to love your enemy. Because if your enemy had an animal that fell into a ditch, wouldn't that be the best? Like, probably kick some dirt on it, walk away. But instead, what does God say? No, you need to go get dirty, risk getting a hoof to the chest, tearing your clothes, whatever it would require to get that heavy beast of burden out of that pit, and thus loving your enemy. Well, now Jesus is saying it explicitly, love your enemy. And then he gives an example that doesn't qualify as truly reflecting the heart of the love of God. He says it's not commendable before the eyes of God to simply love your friends and your family. You need to do that. That's a good thing to do that. Helping a mother who is sick, helping a child or someone who maybe has some financial issues, helping a friend move in. But those are things that we should do. But he goes on to say, hey, what merit is there in that? Because tax collectors do that. Gangbangers do that. Mafia members take care of their own, right? You see, to be exemplary, a Christian loves even his own enemy. That's what sets her or him apart. It reminds me of a time in which the kingdom of Israel was at almost endless war with Syria, just for years and years and years. And so the Syrian army comes down, raids Israel, and they surround one of the prophets named Elisha. And so Elisha goes out to meet those soldiers, and when he does so, God strikes them blind. They can't see. And so now what Elisha does, he leads those blind Syrian soldiers right into the heart of Israel territory, into the capital, Samaria itself. They're surrounded by Israeli soldiers, and now their eyes are open. And now the king cries out to Elisha, and he says, my master, shall we kill? Shall we slay with the sword? To which Elisha replied, no, give them food to eat and water to drink. And so we read what happened in that passage in 2 Kings 6:23. So then he did. The king prepared a great feast for them, and after they ate and drank, he sent them away to their master. So he sends them back to the king, but notice, it says, so the bands of Syrian raiders came no more into the land. This endless feud that existed between Syria and Israel, that what the greatest military might, ingenuity, and wisdom was unable to accomplish, one simple act of kindness towards their enemy was able to achieve. What does Paul say? If your enemy's hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him drink, and in so doing, you shall do what? You're going to pour hot coals of fire on their head. Isn't that what you want for your enemies anyway? Now, we don't know exactly what that means. There's so many interpretations, but basically, it's just love your enemies. You could win them over. Hey, look, there are two ways to defeat the enemy. Hey, one way is to simply get them out of the way. The other one, it's win them to your side. Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a Christian author who was living during the time of Nazi Germany. In fact, he has written one of the most famous commentaries on the passage that we're actually studying here. It's known as The Cost of Discipleship. First half of that book, it is awesome and uber convicting. Bonhoeffer believed that the purest display of the love of God was to associate with the suffering of others, even if it was not for you to suffer. And so Bonhoeffer, for his outspoken comments against the Nazi regime, he was then thrown into a concentration camp, and as he's writing from there, considered it an honor to be able to suffer with the Jewish people, which really wasn't his own suffering. And it's interesting, for these crazy people who say that the Nazis were Christian, they were throwing Christians in concentration camps. But you see, Bonhoeffer saw this as the love of God. God who exists in perfect eternal peace, in his great love for us, made our suffering his suffering. Not only did God, through Jesus Christ, suffer the toils and hardships of this fallen world, but as a father, he experienced the unimaginable. The Father, God, experienced loss, a separation in that relationship between the Father and the Son, his most precious, only begotten, beloved Son. And Jesus experienced the punishment of sin, something that was by no means his to experience. But you see, God, who is love, loved us to the extent that he suffered our own sufferings that we may never have to suffer them. You see, it was Bonhoeffer, while in that concentration camp, he would continually pray for his enemies, Nazi soldiers, whether it's mocking or even physically abusing him. He would eventually die there. And I want to read to you Bonhoeffer's words on his hope for the future of prayer within the church. He says, "The time will come when we shall pray not as isolated individuals, but as a corporate body, a congregation, a church. It's church collective prayer. We shall pray in multitudes, albeit in relatively small multitudes. And among the thousands and thousands of apostates, we shall loudly praise and confess the Lord, who is crucified and risen and shall come again. And what prayer, what confession, what hymn of praise will it be? It will be a prayer of earnest love for these very sons of perdition, who stand around and gaze at us with eyes of flame and hatred, and who have had perhaps already raised their hands to kill us. It will be a prayer for the peace of these erring, devastated, bewildered souls. A prayer for the same love and peace which we ourselves enjoy. A prayer which will penetrate to the depths of their souls and rend their hearts more grievously than anything they can do to us." End quote. Powerful, powerful words. Now, we as Christians, we're continually praying for our leaders and our soldiers, and rightfully so. How about our enemies? Wouldn't it be something if the leaders in Iran got saved? Kim Jong-un, it would be converted. That's crazy. I'm sure they thought that it was crazy to pray for a young zealot named Saul, but look what God did through him. You see, the bar has been set. Verse 48, "You shall be perfect even as your heavenly Father is perfect." This does not mean we have to be perfect to get into heaven, but the perfection is standard, and we must always seek to meet that standard, right? It's like taking one of those panoramic photos on your phone, and there's that straight line. You can't get that thing straight, but that line is there as a standard that you may always come back to it. You see, our love, as greatly as we may fail, has a standard. It is the all-forgiving, all-gracious, never-ceasing love of the Father. The exemplary Christian life loves even its own enemies. So as we finish our study on the exemplary Christian life, it's worth pointing out that the word exemplary comes from the Latin word exemplaris. It actually means imitation. So in that sense, you could say that the exemplary Christian life is exemplary in two ways. First, to use the definition given at the beginning of this message, is to serve as a model, representing the best of its kind. But it's also exemplary in the sense of its original use, an imitation. Paul said, "Imitate me as I imitate Christ." As we leave this building this morning, may we live exemplary Christian lives in two ways. One, may we as Christians be unique. May we be different, representing the best of its kind. Look, your life, my life, they are a book, and every word spoken and every deed performed is determining how that book is being written. May you write it in such a way that others may read it and see that you truly are different. And secondly, let us imitate Christ. It's wonderful to have earthly examples to go before us to show us the way, but ultimately look to Jesus Christ. As the hymn writer penned, turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth shall grow strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. Doesn't matter where you are, what you're going through, the answer's all the same. It is look to Jesus, imitate him. So may God our Father, within the confines of his word, by the power of his Holy Spirit and according to the good pleasure of his will, enable you and I to live the exemplary Christian life. Let's pray.